The Honourable Member from Calgary Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, let me add my deepest condolences to Mila, Carolyn, Ben, Nicholas, and Mark, and the 16 Mulroney grandchildren on behalf of my own family and the people of Calgary Ridge, and on behalf of myself, a Mulroney-era conservative activist. My formative years are bound up in the years Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, and it was during that time that I first became a conservative political activist, something that I have not stopped since that time. And it's impossible to measure the impact of Brian Mulroney's life and legacy without first saying a few words about Canada in 1984. In 1984, Canada was broken. It was quite literally broke. Canada was kiting interest payments on the national debt like an insolvent debtor using one credit card to pay the interest on another. Interest payments from the previous government's debt were 38% of government expenditure. Foreign investment was explicitly discouraged as a matter of national policy. And that was in favor of hundreds of money-losing, taxpayer-funded crown corporations. Canada was not trusted by our most important allies, and the disastrous national energy program had destroyed the Alberta economy. Inflation, interest rates, and unemployment were in the double digits. That was the state of the country that Brian Mulroney was elected to lead. And what followed were a series of reforms and policy reversals that saved this country from the downward spiral that had been set in motion by the government that had come before it. Brian Mulroney became Prime Minister during a dangerous final peak in the Cold War, when the increasingly unstable Soviet Union was led by the government of Konstantin Chernenko, who was the third old, sick, hardline communist leader in as many years, who was running a dangerous, potentially apocalyptic arms race with the West. And it was during this critical, frightening time that Brian Mulroney firmly replanted Canada in the Western camp with countries that shared Canada's values like democracy, pluralism, and the rule of law. This was in sharp contrast to a previous Prime Minister who seemed more comfortable sucking up to dictators of the Soviet bloc like Honecker, Ceausescu, and Castro, rather than leaders of the free world. And it was perhaps in global affairs where Brian Mulroney's star shone the brightest. He reopened Canada to business. And before the end of his first parliament, he negotiated the free trade deal with the United States, ushering in the era of prosperity that followed. He convinced Ronald Reagan to expend Reagan's own domestic political capital so that Canada could have an acid rain treaty. And he was an indispensable ally, Mr. Speaker, in the forcing an end to the hateful apartheid system in South Africa. But by the time of his retirement, he was a global leader with easy and productive relationships with the giants of his time. Francois Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, Reagan, Bush, Thatcher, all of these people took his call anytime. But he didn't just spend his time on the phone talking with world leaders. He always remained grounded to his family, his friends, his caucus, and his party. And his use of the telephone was truly legendary. When I was a very young political activist in that time, people knew that if there was a pressing issue, even right down to local electoral district politics, that he was always a phone call away. Not because he was a micromanager, not because he wanted to stick his, sort of leadership's nose into business. It was because he cared so much and just wanted to help, and he made himself available to people. His humanity, his compassion, and his good humor inspired intense loyalty. And I've been told by many that were in his caucus in those years that even when his government was at 12% in the polls, MPs couldn't wait for Wednesday morning to get together and share in the teamship, the camaraderie and the teamwork of that time, and to hear his pep talk. But all the changes and reforms that Brian Mulroney undertook in his time were met with intense, vitriolic, bitter resistance. the Liberals and NDP of the time viciously opposed free trade. They accused Brian Mulroney of outright disloyalty to Canada. He was accused of selling out Canada to the Americans repeatedly by his opponents on the left. And for some Western Canadians, the changes that he brought didn't come quick enough. He couldn't undo the damage of the previous government quickly enough for some, despite fiscal reform, abolishing the National Energy Program, and mass privatization of state-owned enterprises. Many Quebecers turned their back on Brian Mulroney over the failure of the Meech Lake Accord. So people now have forgotten that the depths of the deeply personal and bitter opposition that Mulroney faced, especially during his second parliament from 1988 to 1993. And so nobody would have blamed Brian Mulroney if he gave up on national affairs. But that was not his way. He could have just walked away. He could have, stopped being a presence in the lives of so many political activists and making all those phone calls. But he didn't do that. His determination in forging a better Canada is matched by his equanimity in the face of tremendous setbacks and opposition. I'm so glad, Mr. Speaker, that he lived long enough to see the undeniable proof of his legacy as a great world leader and a transformational Canadian Prime Minister whose legacy endures. Rest well, Brian Mulroney. With a grateful nation's thanks, posterity is already much kinder to you than your contemporaries were. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.